The History of Harari Slavery. Arab and Ethiopian Slave Trades, by Harari Freethinkers. A reason for the lack of interest in slavery and slave trade in Muslim society. The absence of a large and racially conscious black diaspora who would have a longing to fathom the depths of this great human interest story. Slavery in the Arab World, 1987. The ancient roots of slavery in Ethiopia. Slavery has a long history in Ethiopia. It is believed the practice existed in Ethiopia since antiquity. Until very recently, due to modern laws, slavery was a deeply ingrained part of society. This may be because in many African societies, there were no prison systems, so people were captured and sold. In addition to criminals, people were enslaved in many different ways. They were captured during slave raids, war, motivated by ethnic or religious differences, as will be explored later, or born into slavery from a slave parent. Wealthy Ethiopians, such as emperors, owned thousands of slaves. It is believed the existing slavery system facilitated Arab settlers when they arrived to conduct slavery for their own purposes. However, this does not absolve Arabs and others who exploited, abused, and murdered countless Africans during this brutal period of history. An overview of the Arab slave trade. Ethiopia is the only African country to not be colonized during the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is well known in the West, but there was another slave trade that was far more destructive in duration and severity. This was the Arab slave trade. In pre-Islamic Arabia, slavery was well established before the advent of Islam in the 7th century. The people were connected to intercontinental trade routes that afforded them large numbers of foreign slaves, some European, but mostly Abash or Abyssinian. However, slavery in Arabia became far more expansive after the establishment of Islam. This resulted in large influxes of captives from around the world. Greeks, Turks, Syrians, Indians, Berbers, Persians, Copts, and Nubians. First Arab Muslims looked to Eastern and Central Europe for white slaves to bring to the Middle East. But the growing military power of Europe made it difficult to expand, and resulted in a shortage of slaves. This was when Arab Muslims started looking to Africa for slaves. The Arab slave trade occurred across Africa, from east to west. Arabs would acquire slaves through conquest of land, purchase, and kidnapping. For example, some children in East Africa were even lured into the slave trade with fruit. It appears that most Arabs didn't hunt down slaves themselves. Instead, they leveraged the native people, middlemen, and local customs to acquire slaves. These raids were bloody expeditions and resulted in the movement of slaves from between Somalia and Mozambique to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Zanzibar acted as the hub for the traffic. Ethiopian slaves were exported at 3 main outlets: Matama on the Sudanese border, Massawa, Eritrea, for Red Sea trade, and Tagura, Djibouti, for the Indian Ocean. Slaves were sold in slave markets in Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Mecca, and other places. The slave trade was the main driver of the economy in the Tagura and Massawa ports. For example, according to British diplomat Walter Plowden, Muslim slave traders of Massawa made their entire living by trading slaves and other products with Abyssinians. Mecca became the center of the slave trade in the world and remained that way well into the 20th century. During the reign of the Ottoman Empire, it was reported that Arab slave owners would bring their Ethiopian slaves to Hajj every year. According to the Egyptian historian El-Makrizi, Munsa Musa brought Ethiopian slave girls with him on his way back from Hajj. Slaves were used as servants, harem keepers, laborers, sexual pleasure, and to increase numbers in armies as soldiers. It is estimated between 11 and 14 million Africans were transported into the Islamic world during the slave trade's 14th century duration. The Arab slave trade had an extremely high death rate. For every one person enslaved that survived, it is estimated that 10 other people were killed. Arabs and Ethiopian slaves. I have been asked about slaves from the land of Abyssinia who profess monotheism and accept the rules of holy law. Is it legal or not to buy and sell them? If their conversion to Islam comes after the establishment of a property right on these slaves, then Islam does not demand liberation because slavery was caused by disbelief. The state of servitude continues after the disappearance of disbelief because of its existence in the past. Ahmed al-Wancharizi, 1430–1431 to 1508. Arab slave traders could not enslave Muslims because it is against Sharia law. However, in practice that was not the case. It is known that African Muslim slaves were still enslaved by Arabs even though it was against Sharia law. There became growing concern among tribal and religious leaders in Africa who saw their fellow African Muslims enslaved by Muslim traders. When the African Muslims encountered Arab slave traders, they would say they were Muslims, but they were ignored and taken captive anyway. In fact, there was a legal case where an Ethiopian Muslim was enslaved by a fellow Muslim. The jurist, Ahmed al-Wancharizi, 1430–1431 to 1508, declared if the slave trader was uncertain of the slave's religion before purchasing them, it didn't matter if it turned out that they were a Muslim. They were still enslaved. This ruling was used as a rationale for later cases. The legal system thus gives slave traders the benefit of the doubt and excused the slave trade of African Muslims, which was against Sharia law. Being an Ethiopian Muslim was therefore no guarantee to escape slavery. This shows how one of the ways Islam spread in Ethiopia was fear. It is an innate human desire to preserve life by avoiding humiliation, abuse, and death. As a way to escape the harrowing fate of being a slave, Ethiopians could have accepted Islam. As will be explored later in this article, historically, politics is central to religious conversion and slavery in Ethiopia. Slaves from Ethiopia were in high demand in the Middle East. According to the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, Ethiopian slaves were thought to have good character and were trustworthy. They had many different roles, including bodyguards and business managers. Ethiopia was known as the best place to get eunuchs to be used as doorkeepers and servants at mosques in Medina. They were put to work on date plantations in Iran and Iraq, and were even trained to dive for pearls in Bahrain, which lasted well into the 20th century. Light-skinned Ethiopian girls were the most valued and became sex slaves, concubines, to the wealthy and even mothers to rulers. Their value was determined by their skin color. The red, light-skinned Ethiopian girls cost more to purchase than the darker-skinned girls. The price to purchase an Ethiopian girl in the 1920s was at most just £100. These girls were from the Oromo and Sidama areas. Islam, anti-black racism and slavery. The only peoples to accept slavery are the Negroes, because of their lower degree of humanity, their place being closer to the animal stage. Tunisian Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, 1332–1406. The Arab slave trade promoted racialist and essentialist theories on blacks as inferior by nature. A common explanation for the Arab slave trade by Muslims is that people are not perfect, i.e., they can be racist, but Islam is perfect and it doesn't allow racism. Arguably the most popular black figure in Islam is Bilal. According to the Hadith, Bilal was Prophet Muhammad's slave who had the honor of being the first person to make the adhan, call to prayer. While current perceptions of Islam and black people in the West are often romanticized, the Quran and Hadith tell a different story. On the day, some faces will turn white and some faces will turn black. As for those whose faces turn black, to them it will be said, "Did you disbelieve after your belief? Then taste the punishment for what you used to reject." In this verse, having one's skin turn black is punishment for disbelieving in Islam. The faces that turn white are of those who believed in Islam. This shows how in Islam, blackness is associated with evilness, while whiteness is associated with goodness. In another hadith, blackness is destined for hell, while whiteness is destined for paradise. The Prophet said, "Listen and obey your chief, even if an Ethiopian whose head is like a raisin were made your chief." In this verse, the Prophet instructs Muslims to follow their chief even if they were an Ethiopian whose head looked like a raisin. This shows the social hierarchy that existed at the time, where Ethiopians were seen as lower in social status compared to other Muslims. The comparison to a wrinkled raisin is also completely unnecessary and adds no value to the message being conveyed. In another authentic hadith, it is stated that an Ethiopian will destroy the Kaaba and steal its treasure. Malik related to me that he heard that Abdullah ibn Masud used to say, "The slave continues to lie and a black spot grows in his heart until all his heart becomes black. Then he is written, in Allah's sight, among the liars." In this hadith, a slave's continuous lying was thought to make its heart turn black. Here, blackness is associated with lying. There came a slave and pledged allegiance to Allah's apostle. On migration, he, the Holy Prophet, did not know that he was a slave. Then there came his master and demanded him back, whereupon Allah's apostle said, "Sell him to me." And he bought him for 2 black slaves, and he did not afterwards take allegiance from anyone until he had asked him whether he was a slave or a free man. In this hadith, the Prophet traded 2 black slaves for 1 non-black slave. Because slavery is a business transaction of value, the 2 black slaves were equal to the 1 non-black slave. If this weren't the case, the sale wouldn't happen because it wouldn't have been a fair trade. Concerning the dream of the Prophet, in Medina, the Prophet said, "I saw, in a dream, a black woman with unkempt hair going out of Medina and settling at Mahayeh. I interpreted that as a symbol of the epidemic of Medina being transferred to Mahayeh, namely, Al-Jufa." In this hadith, the Prophet seeing a black woman is interpreted as a bad omen. In another hadith, it is said that a sign of the hour, end of time, will be when a slave gives birth to their mistress. The slave is synonymous with a non-Arab and the mistress is synonymous with an Arab. If one were to study the Quran and Hadith, it's easy to see why in Islamic civilizations, blackness has historically been used for justifying who and how people should be enslaved. The acknowledgement of the lower social status of Ethiopians is also present in the doctrine of the Kharijites, who preached, "The most qualified man should reign, even if he was an Abyssinian slave." Black skin in almost all Islamic societies, including parts of Sudan, was and is still associated with slavery. The association of blackness with slavery is also seen in the Arabic language. Historically, the word Mamluks referred to white slaves and meant owned. The word abd was used to refer to black slaves and actually means slaves. Over time, the word abd became used colloquially by Arabs to refer to any black person, slave or free. Ironically, Arab men saw themselves above the African slaves yet felt threatened by them. The Arab men were so afraid that the Arab women would prefer African men that they castrated them and then fueled a false stereotype that Africans were hypersexual. Even Bilal's life wasn't as admirable as it is sometimes romanticized to have been. He was a companion of the Prophet whose job it was to yell at the top of his lungs 5 times a day to announce prayer. He had to wake up before sunrise and then stay up until after the last prayer. This is a job that is glorified by Muslims. But to be used as a humanized megaphone 5 times a day, every day, would have been exhausting. Bilal was ordered to repeat the wording of the adhan for prayers twice, and to pronounce the wording of the Iqama once, except Kad Kamat is Solat. For a period of time, Bilal was owned by Abu Bakr and then later freed. Bilal said to Abu Bakr, "If you have bought me for yourself, then keep me, for yourself, but if you have bought me for Allah's sake, then leave me for Allah's work." While of course, Islam did not start anti-black racism in the world, the Islamic scripture is a reflection of the attitudes about black people held by some at the time in Arabia. Because the Quran and Hadith are used as guidance by Muslims, the anti-black sentiment becomes codified in Islam. Islam's association of blackness with evilness, low social status and value, lying and punishment provides a rationale for anti-black racism among Muslims. The hierarchy solidified by Islam of Arabs on top, and blacks on the bottom is reflected both in the mistreatment of blacks historically in the Muslim world and as the justification for their enslavement. The following hadith is often quoted in defense against the claim that Islam is a racist religion. There is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, nor of a non-Arab over an Arab, nor of a white over a black, nor of a black over a white, except with piety. The message of unity of Muslims, regardless of background, is a clear example of how Islam often contradicts itself. The previous examples of Islamic texts show a clear bias against blackness and black people, yet this one example professes that all Muslims are equal. This lack of internal consistency is one of many indicators as to why Islam is a man-made religion. The reality of slavery in Islamic history. Historically in the Islamic world and in many other parts of the world, slavery was an integral part of everyday life. It was not seen as something immoral. This is especially true in the Islamic world because it is sanctioned by Islamic law. Because many slaves were used for housework or labor and because there were not many, recorded, large-scale revolts, it is believed that most slaves seemed accepting of their situation. Due to the integrative nature of slavery within Islam, slaves were not looked at as strangers. Many slaves were gradually absorbed within the society. Some slaves gained high positions in their societies. Former slaves also had the potential to raise their rank in society as well, like Bilal. However, it's important to keep in mind that cases like Bilal were the exception, and not the rule during the times of the Arab slave trade. Far more slaves were not as fortunate. In fact, American historian Frederick Copper believes slaves reaching high positions does not represent the flexibility of the slave system, but rather, the inability of the slave owners to control their subordinates. However, the functionality of slavery in Islamic societies does not erase the inhumane violence, death, and tragedy that many slaves had to endure. The people who were enslaved experienced psychological trauma by being forcibly taken away from their homes, families, and friends to unknown lands. The transportation from one land to another was dangerous, especially for boys and men who were recovering from being castrated. They would have been exposed to new diseases that their ancestors had never encountered, making them susceptible to mass infections and death. In fact, Ethiopian slaves were prone to getting tubercular diseases. They would have experienced a language barrier as well, which would have made communicating difficult. The slaves had insufficient food and water, which led to hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion. Boys were subjected to the deadly act of castration. The Arabs did this to prevent the boys from having sex with and reproducing with the women in the area. The act carried a high mortality rate. It is estimated 60% of boys and men died from their wounds. They were robbed of the opportunity to experience sexual pleasure and have children because of it. This act caused physical, emotional, and psychological trauma to countless boys and men. Girls and women were also the victims of brutal violence. The majority of slaves were actually women who were used mostly for domestic services and sex. In Islam, it is permissible for a man to have sex with his slave. These girls and women were raped by their masters and looked at as objects and not people. Their value was from their bodies and it was commercialized by men. They experienced a great deal of humiliation, pain, and suffering. If a young girl were to become pregnant, she faced high risks of complications and even death associated with childbirth. In slave markets, girls and women who were on sale for sex stood naked and were inspected like animals. If a Muslim man was interested in buying her, he would touch her anywhere on her body, violating the girl or woman in public. This was an unimaginably humiliating, traumatizing, degrading, and psychologically damaging experience. The opportunities, quality of life, and degree of control a slave had depended on their master. The agency of these people was stolen from them. They lived a life dedicated to servitude at no fault of their own. They were either born into it, abducted, or captured during a raid or war. The integration of slavery within Islamic societies does not erase the harmful effects and tragedy experienced by millions of people. Quite simply, if slaves seemed to be accepting of their situation, it was because they didn't have any other choice. Early evidence of slavery in the Harla region. They said, "O Messenger of Allah, pray to Allah to grant us victory and to give us their lands as spoils of war, and to destroy their lands at our hands." About the cities of Caesar, so the Messenger of Allah prayed for that. Then he said, "Then I struck the third blow, and the cities of Ethiopia were shown to me, and the villages around them, and I saw them with my own eyes." But the Messenger of Allah said at that point, "Leave the Ethiopians alone so long as they leave you alone, and leave the Turks alone so long as they leave you alone." The hadith mentioned above shows how eager the companions of the Prophet were to go to war with other nations, take their land as spoils of the war, and destroy their cities. But was this also the fate of the ancestors of the Harari people? At first, early settlers did not invade Ethiopia and immediately start wars and cause destruction. For example, Muslim traders settled in villages along trade routes to Xyla from the 10th century. They lived among the Ethiopians and traded with them. It wasn't until the 12th century when Islam started spreading in the areas near Harar, likely first with the Argoba peoples. The Muslim empire slowly grew to the point where it engaged in a conflict with the Christian Amhara people. The empire was likely a mix of Muslims, Arab and non-Arab Muslims, and local Ethiopian converts. Because it was an Islamic empire, legally the Muslims could enslave the Christian and pagan peoples, but not other Muslims. This is likely why the Amhara people left. If they wanted to maintain their religion and stay in the region, their only options were to be enslaved or be subjected to the jizya payment, whichever was enforced by the Muslim ruler, as will be described in the next section. As mentioned previously, slavery in Ethiopia has existed since antiquity. Slavery was widespread in Ethiopia, and it is estimated that at least 1 out of 3 Ethiopians were enslaved at different parts of history. Arabs have been engaged in the slave trade with Ethiopia since before the advent of Islam. Excavations in Harla have revealed the local people were involved in international trade of various ceramics with people from Egypt, India, the Maldives, China, and the Middle East. Along with the trade of material goods, slaves were also bought and sold. The ceramics have been dated to the mid-6th to 15th centuries. During all or some of this time period, people from around modern-day Harar were exported as slaves to supply markets in the Near and Middle East, including Egypt. The persistence of local ceramics observed at Harla sites show how Muslim contacts at Harla didn't convert the pagan population. Some adopted Islam, but the Islamization process was gradual. This is likely because alongside the trading of physical goods, slaves were needed to be bought from abroad and sold to export. The expanding Islamic empire needed slaves, and as previously mentioned, Ethiopians were among the most desired slaves. It is known that Ethiopian rulers gained wealth from slavery and the slave trade since antiquity. The emphasis on this revenue option increased in the 13th century as Abyssinia expanded. According to Aden port records, there was an increase in Ethiopian slaves being imported to Yemen between the 13th and 15th centuries. The increase in slaves during this time is also related to the wars between Christians and Muslims in Ethiopia, described in the next section. Politics, slavery, and religious conversion in historical Ethiopia, 14th to 16th century. Slavery was the function of war and violence. The strongest and the victorious would use violence and coercion to make the weakest forced to accept it. Propagators of Islam in Africa often revealed a cautious attitude towards proselytizing because of its effect in reducing the potential reservoir of slaves. More pagan people embracing Islam meant less slaves. This meant less people to use as free labor, less girls to have sex with, and less resources in possession to trade. Unless one was personally motivated to spread Islam and create an Islamic state, they would not preach Islam. Examples of this approach to pagans can be seen by the Muslims in the Sultanate of Bagirmi, Chad, and Adamawa, northern Cameroon, who didn't want to convert them because it would mean less slaves and less people to pay taxes. However, it will be demonstrated that historically, Ethiopian Muslim rulers have both enslaved non-Muslim people and converted them to Islam during times of war. For instance, in the 14th century, Amdassayan chronicles how subjects of his Christian empire were captured by the neighboring Islamic empire and were forced to convert to Islam. Some of them had high positions in the Christian church. After 1332, when the Ethiopian kingdom acquired many Muslim polities, the Ethiopian kingdom and Adal Sultanate engaged in back-and-forth raiding and counter-raiding. In the 15th century, a sultan of Adal, Jamal ad-Din II, is said to have flooded Middle Eastern markets, India, Greece, and Persia with Abyssinian slaves. In the late 15th and 16th centuries, an Adali general, Mafis, led slave raiding campaigns and likely sent most to merchants and some to the ruler of Yemen. By 1540, Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi's Ahmad Gran jihad had expanded the Islamic Empire by taking over land previously owned by the Ethiopian kingdom. This led to mass enslavement of the local Ethiopian Christians. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the port of Zila on the Somali coast, modern Somaliland, was the largest market for slaves in the Horn of Africa. This was where Arab merchants acquired slaves. Ethiopian Christians exported slaves too, but not as much as Arab and Muslims in Ethiopia. Regardless of who was selling the slaves, there was much demand for Ethiopian slaves abroad. For example, in the Gujarat and Deccan areas of India, Ethiopian slaves were used as soldiers and sailors. Ethiopian women, called Habashiyas, were also in high demand in Constantinople, Cairo, and Alexandria. Besides mass enslavement of Ethiopian Christians, Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi's empire also forced them to convert to Islam. It is estimated that 9 out of 10 Christians converted to Islam. Islamically, the leader of the jihad has a few options when dealing with prisoners of war. They could kill them, enslave them, hold them for ransom, or keep them as non-Muslim subjects in the Islamic State and have them pay the jizya payment. During the reign of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, he used all options. After the end of the jihad in 1543, the Christians recovered and enslaved the Muslims, converting them to Christianity. The 14-year jihad war ended with the killing of the Muslim leader, Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. The Ethiopian kingdom was declared the victors. The regulation of slavery in Ethiopia. The Christian and Muslim empires in Ethiopia operated by different rules when dealing with slavery. For the Christians, the Fetha Negast is a legal code that was used in Ethiopia. It was translated from the 13th century Arabic writings of a Coptic Egyptian writer, Abu el-Fada'il ibn al-Asl. The first recorded use of the Fetha Negast in Ethiopia was in the 16th century. However, when the code first started being enforced, and to what degree it was followed, is not known. One law found in the Fetha Negast is the requirement of Christian Ethiopians to convert their slaves to Christianity. In the document, non-Christians, prisoners of war, and the children of slaves could all be legally enslaved. Also, women who lived with or married a slave could also be enslaved. Failure to pay a debt could also result in temporary enslavement. The Fetha Negast prohibited the sale of slaves to non-Christians. This meant Muslims in Ethiopia could only buy slaves from other Muslims and pagans. Because Islam forbade the enslavement of other Muslims, Muslim slave traders in Ethiopia were limited to buying pagan slaves only. Despite the Fetha Negast, Muslims in Ethiopia could still acquire any slave they desired as a product of war, slave raids, and from sellers outside the Ethiopian kingdom. It seems that at one point at least, there was a widespread issue with Christian slave traders not following the regulations for slavery. In 1548, there was an edict ruling where the Ethiopian king, King Galatas, declared Christians could not sell slaves to non-believers and they could not be exported out of Ethiopia. The penalty for breaking this law was death. Slaves were restricted in their life choices since they couldn't own property, make wills without the permission of their owner, or have certain careers. But there was some humility in the law as slaves couldn't be sold to different traders if it separated the family. The Fetha Negast also outlines many instances when a slave could be freed, such as if the slave became a soldier, saved their master's life, or if their slave owner died without an heir. The Quran and Hadith is what provided Muslim slave traders with their regulations for slavery. Of course, as with the Fetha Negast for the Christians, how closely Islamic rules for slavery were followed is not known. Islamic law allowed the buying and selling of already existing slaves, but not the enslavement of a free person. The exception is during war, where the enslavement of free people from the opposing side is considered a reward for fighting for Allah. Muslims were not allowed to become enslaved by other Muslims, but Muslim slaves were considered superior to non-Muslim slaves. Islam governed what a slave could and couldn't do. For instance, slave girls couldn't be forced in prostitution. However, they were considered the property of their master, so they were raped. Slaves weren't allowed to run away from their masters. If a Muslim slave tried to escape, they were now a disbeliever and their prayers would not be accepted. The Hadith encourages good treatment of slaves. However, the standard of what is considered treating a slave well depends on the slave master. For example, the Hadith proclaims slaves shouldn't be hit without committing a reasonable offense. This puts the slave at the mercy of his owner and his definition of what is an intolerable offense deserving of physical abuse. Throughout the Hadith, freeing slaves is encouraged. But the Hadith also implies it may be better to keep slaves in slavery rather than freeing them. The freeing of slaves is also required for specific circumstances, like during solar and lunar eclipses, or if one accidentally kills a Muslim. The differences between Fetha Negast and Islamic law meant there were two distinct systems of slavery in Ethiopia. How one could be enslaved, who could enslave them, how they were treated, what they were allowed to do, and how they could be freed all depended on the religion of their slave master and how much they adhered to these laws. Slavery in modern Harar, since the 19th century. Slaves from the Ethiopian region continued to be distributed in Middle Eastern markets into the 20th century. The scale of slavery within Ethiopia itself was massive during this time. In 1926, it is believed that out of the population of 10 million people, 2 million people, or 1 in 5 were slaves. Slavery was officially abolished in Ethiopia by Emperor Haile Selassie in 1942. It was one of many attempts at modernizing the nation after the defeat of Italian invaders in 1941. Harar is no exception to the large scale of slavery practiced in Ethiopia. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Harar was a major trade center which included the trade of slaves. In 1855, British explorer Richard Burton described Harar as being populated with noticeably more women than men because of the more numerous slave girls. In the 19th century, slaves were one of the main exports out of Harar. The scale of slavery in Harar caused Burton to declare Harar the great halfway house of slaves that came from Janjaro, Gurage, and Oromo territories. According to Burton, the last slave caravan each year that left Harar for Berbera would carry around 500 slaves. The caravans before the last one are believed to have carried several hundreds each as well. A single slave trader could transport over 100 slaves on trade routes such as from Harar to Shawa. The Abyssinian and Amhara slaves were the most valued. Some slaves stayed in Harar, while others were bought and taken abroad. As one can imagine, the slaves were not happy about their status. Slaves tried to escape while en route to trading centers and were sometimes successful. Slave girls were used as domestic workers and concubines, sex slaves, in the Islamic world, and Harar was no exception. According to Richard Burton's account, he witnessed slave girls preparing meals and conversing with each other. Harari men also possessed sex slaves. If a Harari man freed a slave, he could then take her as a wife or concubine, sex slave. If the freed slave is taken as a wife and she has a child, the child is called garwalad. If the wife who was previously a slave was taken to Harar from another area, she could now learn the ways of the city and become accepted as socially Harari. Her children would be considered Harari as it is the ethnic origin of their father. It appears that the Harari people themselves were not, on a large scale at least, bought and sold as slaves. However, they are still a product of slavery because women who were bought were sometimes married into the Harari community. Also, once slavery was abolished, the freed slaves would have been integrated into the community as well, unless they left. Overall, since Harar was the trading post for incoming slaves from abroad, it seems that the Harari people mainly functioned as facilitators and sellers of slaves. The legacy of slavery in Ethiopia. Can we document the relation between past evidence of slavery and contemporary patterns of discrimination, exclusion, and servitude in Ethiopia? Revisiting Slavery and the Slave Trade in Ethiopia, 2017. The Arab slave trade lasted more than 14 centuries. It continued legally, in one form or another until well into the 1960s. In addition, as late as the 20th century, while the enslavement of Muslims was not allowed Islamically, the law was generally ignored. Women married Muslim men, who then brought them to Mecca on pilgrimage and then sold them into slavery. Non-Arab children entrusted Arabs to bring them to Mecca for religious instruction, only for them to be sold once they arrived. The British freed slaves, including Ethiopian slaves, and then shipped them back to Ethiopia. If the slave did not know where they originated, their place of origin would be guessed based on their appearance. Many arrived in the Hijaz as children and only knew Arabic. Thus, the reintegration of these children into Ethiopian society presented many linguistic and cultural challenges. The fate of these children and adults once they arrived back in Ethiopia remain unknown. To this day, slavery still exists illegally in the Muslim world because it is permitted by Islamic law. In recent years, various Islamic regimes have used Sharia law to justify the enslavement of people after they raid villages. Slavery has grown in African countries like Libya, which is a transit hub for migrants and refugees across the continent hoping to reach Europe. Even in non-combative situations, today, Ethiopian domestic workers are sometimes treated like slaves in the Middle East under the kafala system. A modern form of the slave trade now operates illegally through apps that are used in the Middle East for buying and selling slaves, disguised as domestic workers. The legacy of the Arab slave trade is not just present in the treatment of Africans, but also in languages around the world. In modern-day Arabic, the word abid or abid is used to refer to both an African and a slave. The Arab slave trade legacy also continues in the Harari language, where we use the word red to refer to a light-skinned person. The Arab buyers preferred the young light-skinned red Ethiopian girls over the darker ones because they found them more beautiful. So, as the natural process of supply and demand predicts, the more men who wanted to purchase the girls meant their market price was higher. The men who purchased the light-skinned Ethiopian girls were only those who were wealthy enough to afford them. The result was that the light-skinned girls became sex slaves to the wealthy and had a higher standard of living than dark-skinned girls. Because the light-skinned girls were more highly valued by slave traders and subsequently had a better quality of life than girls with dark complexions, they became socially favored among the population. It is believed that in ancient Africa, prior to the subjugation of Africans by outsiders, skin color or shade was not a relevant characteristic. Africans identified each other based on shared culture, traditions, and language. This stratification of Africans based on skin color was introduced by foreigners because of their own bias and agendas. Similarly, during the transatlantic slave trade, slave traders also employed the non-native concept of skin color to divide and control African slaves. In Harari culture today, some people have continued this bias in favor of light-skinned people, particularly in women and girls. The legacy of the Arab slave traders' bias for fairer-complexioned girls is likely a major contributor as to why, even today, some Harari people informally describe each other as either light-skinned, or Dama or Te, dark-skinned. Within Ethiopia as a whole, slavery has left its mark as well. Because religious belief was sometimes forced onto slaves based on who enslaved them. Over a period of hundreds of years, an unimaginable number of people experienced life as being members of both faiths. For thousands of Ethiopians, they were not Muslim or Christian because they found the religion convincing and chose to accept it as truth. They were a Muslim or a Christian because they were forced to be. The descendants of these slaves then carried on that religious identity that was initially forced onto their ancestors. Thus the future generations believed in the religion they are raised in not because it represents an objective truth, but because of the historical political warfare lived through by their ancestors. Perhaps it is the history of state-enforced religious conversions of slaves in Ethiopia that has contributed to interreligious practices throughout the country. For one, during the festival of Abo at Mount Sequala, which is dedicated to the Christian Saint Gevra Memphis Kiddus, the people sing songs with frequent mentions of Allah, Abash, and other Islamic saints. This blurring of religious boundaries may, at least in part, be because of the swift changes in religious identity that was required upon forced conversions. If large groups of people are required to change their religious beliefs immediately, the impact on established cultural practices would take time. The people didn't choose to convert. If given the choice, they likely would want to continue their ancestral practices. An example of the continuation of previously held beliefs is the Oromo in the 20th century. During this time, they continued to practice Wakafana in private while publicly declaring to be either Christian or Muslim. Therefore, it's understandable how forced converts would knowingly or unknowingly carry on their traditional practices. Another possible reason for the blurring of religious boundaries is that some Ethiopian people are simply more tolerant of those who believe in other religions because of the long history of religious coexistence in the country. The legacy of the Arab slave trade is also left in the large diaspora communities of Africans in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. In Oman and in India, these descendants of African merchants and slaves are called Habshi, while in Southeast Asia, they are called Sidi. It is believed that the famous African samurai Yasuke was a Habshi. Conclusion. As a history, it has to be told to the next generation. What they think of it, that is up to them. But they should learn it to help them see injustice. Zerfi Arga. Since antiquity, slavery has been practiced in Ethiopia. After the advent of Islam, it became amplified, driven by the need to support the growing Islamic empires. The Arab slave trade in Ethiopia is characterized by inhumane violence, unimaginable suffering, humiliation, and mass death. Underlying the practice was anti-black racism that was codified through Islamic scriptures. Slavery likely helped support early Muslim communities within the ancestral areas of the Harari people. Over time, warring religious empires weaponized enslavement and the forced conversions of civilians living in lands ruled by their opponents. A slave's quality of life depended on many factors, but they were all denied the fundamental human right to be truly free. An examination into slavery in the city of Harar reveals that it was practiced in ways consistent with the Islamic world. Slavery played a critical role in the economy of Harar prior to being outlawed in the 20th century. The social and economic effects of the end of slavery in Harar is an unexplored area of research. Considering the long history and large scale of slavery, it is likely that many Harari people can trace their lineage to a slave. Because slavery was legally abolished in both Ethiopia and the Arab world just over 60 years ago, the parents and grandparents of Harari people living today could have been involved as either slave traders or even slaves. The legacy of slavery lives on in language, social attitudes, religious beliefs, cultural traditions, and even the existence of whole communities. It is important to reiterate that slavery is not a practice that can be dismissed as merely an unfortunate reality of Ethiopia's past. Currently, in the 21st century, modern-day slavery of people, including Ethiopians, continues illegally in the Middle East. Because slavery is regulated in Islamic scripture, the complete abolishment of this practice is not Islamic. Its eventual abandonment in the 20th century after being practiced for over 1,300 years by Muslims was because of secular laws, not Sharia law. Like all African Muslims, the Harari should acknowledge how slavery played a critical role in the lives of their ancestors. For much of Harar's history, an essential part of the building and sustaining of Harar was from the work of slaves and the income they provided.